There is a scene in Game of Thrones that everyone remembers, but almost nobody has fully examined. Ned Stark in the dungeon, Varys standing over him in the dark, dressed as a jailer, speaking quietly. No witnesses, no agenda that either man fully declares. Just two people who understand the political situation more clearly than almost anyone else in King's Landing, having the most honest conversation in the entire first season. Everyone remembers the outcome. Ned confesses. He loses his head anyway. Varys apparently failed to save him, or chose not to, depending on how generously you read the scene. But go back and watch what actually happens in that cell. Not the plot mechanics, but the conversation itself. Because something passes between these two men that the show never circles back to directly, and the ripple from it runs all the way to Varys burning letters on a hillside, 7 seasons later. The surface reading is straightforward. Varys visits Ned to pressure him into a confession. He frames it practically. Bend the knee, say the words, Joffrey shows mercy, and the girls stay safe.
Tell the Queen you will confess your vile treason. Tell your son to lay down his sword and proclaim Joffrey as the true heir.
Varys presents it as the only logical move available, and Ned, who has spent his entire life treating honor as an absolute rather than a negotiating position, resists.
You think my life is some precious thing to me?
Not because he doesn't understand the logic. He understands it perfectly, and resists because he believes the truth has a political weight that survival calculations don't account for. That distinction is what most people skip over. Ned doesn't just refuse to confess. He tells Varys something specific. He tells him that Joffrey isn't Robert's son, that the throne sits on a lie, that the succession itself is rotten at the source.
Stannis Baratheon is Robert's true heir.
And he says this not as a man making a desperate argument for his own life, but as a man who seems genuinely confused that the people around him are treating an illegitimate succession as a minor administrative problem to be managed, rather than a foundational catastrophe. Watch Varys in this moment. He doesn't argue, he doesn't dismiss it. He goes quiet in a way that's different from his usual controlled composure. The information isn't new to him, because Varys always knows things before everyone else does. But something about the way Ned says it lands differently. Because Ned isn't presenting it as intelligence or leverage. He's presenting it as a moral self-evidence, as if the rightness of the true succession is simply a fact that the world will eventually be forced to organize itself around, regardless of what any individual chooses to do in the meantime. Varys has spent his entire career doing the opposite of this. He manages, he adjusts, he calculates which unstable ruler produces the least damage, and positions himself to steer outcomes accordingly. His explicit political philosophy, which he articulates several times across the series, is that he serves the realm rather than any particular king, which sounds principled, and maybe it is, in his own framework. But what Ned's position in that cell exposes, without Ned even meaning to expose it, is the internal contradiction in that framework. You cannot serve the realm while protecting an illegitimate succession. Those two commitments eventually collide, and when they do, every accommodation made along the way, every bend, every quiet look the other way, every letter not sent, becomes part of the damage. Ned doesn't say this explicitly. He doesn't have the political language for it, but the logic is sitting there in the cell between them, and Varys is smart enough to feel it, even if he doesn't fully acknowledge it in the moment. Now this is the point where the theory earns its weight, because after this scene, Varys' choices begin a long, slow drift in a very specific direction. He stops being content to manage around bad rulers, and starts becoming increasingly invested in the question of who should actually sit on the throne. Not just who is safest or most controllable or least likely to destabilize trade, but who has the legitimate claim, or on whom the realm's stability genuinely depends. He backs Daenerys. Then, when Jon's true parentage emerges, he pivots toward Jon with what the show frames as almost desperate urgency. His final act before his execution is trying to spread the truth about Jon's Targaryen blood to as many people as possible. He burns letters, he pays poisoners, he risks everything, not on a political calculation about outcomes, but on a principle about rightful succession. That is Ned Stark's argument, almost word for word. The man who sat in that dungeon and told Varys the truth had a weight that political management couldn't indefinitely defer, and Varys spends the rest of the series slowly arriving at the same conclusion. Not because Ned convinced him in any clean, dramatic sense, but because Ned planted a splinter, and every subsequent catastrophe, Joffrey's cruelty, Cersei's maneuvering, the endless instability of a throne built on a foundational lie, drove that splinter a little deeper. Now test this honestly, because the theory deserves to be challenged. You could argue that Varys was already moving toward a legitimate succession candidate before the dungeon scene. His early investment in Daenerys predates Ned's arrest. His network in Essos was already watching her. So maybe the seed wasn't planted by Ned at all. Maybe it was already growing, and Ned's words just happened to align with a trajectory already in motion. That's fair, and it probably carries some truth. But here's the difference the dungeon scene makes. Before that conversation, Varys' investment in Daenerys reads as strategic. He wants a ruler he can work with, a Targaryen restoration that he has positioned himself to influence. It's still management, just with a longer time horizon. The Varys of the early seasons isn't operating from principle. He's operating from a very sophisticated version of the same pragmatism that makes him visit Ned in the first place. What shifts, gradually and then unmistakably, is that Varys stops being willing to compromise on the succession question when it actually costs him something. He doesn't just back the most viable candidate, he backs the right one. He tells Tyrion later that he chose Daenerys because he believed she would make the world better. That's not the language of a political manager. That's the language of someone who has decided that the truth of a claim matters more than just its utility. Something moved him from one position to the other, and the dungeon scene with Ned is the most clearly documented moment where he was directly, personally confronted with the argument that legitimate succession isn't just idealism. It's the only thing that can produce lasting stability. There's one more layer that the scene carries, and the show never fully develops. Ned, in that cell, mentions his daughters, not as a strategic concession, but as a real human weight he's holding. He's trying to balance two things that his entire life has never required him to balance before: truth and survival. His own survival, but more painfully, his children's. And Varys, who has also spent his life navigating the gap between those two things, watches this happen with an expression that reads less like manipulation and more like recognition. These are two men who both believe in something beyond personal survival. One of them has never learned to hide it. The other has spent decades hiding nothing else. And the tragedy is that they agree on almost everything that matters. The throne is corrupt, the succession is illegitimate, the realm is in genuine danger, and they still cannot save each other or themselves. Ned dies because he couldn't compromise truth for survival. Varys dies 7 seasons later because he finally stopped compromising truth for survival. The man in the dungeon told Varys something he already half knew, but hadn't yet decided to act on. And when he finally does act on it, fully, irreversibly, and at the cost of his life, the argument he's making to Tyrion on that hillside is structurally identical to the argument a half-broken lord made to him in the dark beneath the Red Keep years earlier. Ned Stark didn't change Varys' mind in that cell. He just showed him what it looks like when a man refuses to pretend the truth doesn't matter. Varys spent the rest of the series trying to solve the catastrophe Ned had already correctly diagnosed. He just waited too long to stop managing it. This is Plotcorn, and there is always more to the story.